building 0 to 1 products in brand new markets and new product categories is dramatically different than those that are even adjacent or touching existing product categories. And I think it's important that people understand those differences. And that's where this, honestly, a lot of the arguments about lean startup are really a category problem, not a process problem. It's the right process for the right thing. Welcome back for part 2 of our episode of Unsolicited Feedback with Sachin Rekhi. I'm your host, Fareed Mosavat. Sachin is a multi-time 0 to 1 product builder. He's been a founder at companies like Anywhere.fm and NoteJoy, and he also shipped the 0 to 1 first version of the LinkedIn Sales Navigator at LinkedIn. He has a ton of experience building these 0 to 1 products, and today we dive into what I think is a relatively controversial topic. Is the minimum viable product, is the traditional lean startup method good enough anymore? We ask this question. We riff on it based on a blog post from one of the founders at Linear about how they launched their product. And we try to figure out, where is it appropriate to build a small, scrappy thing? And where is it appropriate to dive deeper and try to build a higher quality product at launch? We try to answer the question, what is good enough to actually get real validated data on new products, and dive into some of the other approaches beyond just the engineering and building of a product towards how should I launch? How should I think about a wait list? How should I think about narrowing my audience tightly in order to get real feedback? And all of the different strategies around getting a product to market. I hope you enjoy this one. I found it illuminating as a person who hasn't been as deeply involved in 0 to 1 building. And there are a lot of lessons here for anyone building something new. I think we talked a bunch about like novelty effects, the rising bar for what it means to engage with a product. And I think what this has probably done is made the search for product market fit a lot more elusive. You've written a course on helping people find product market fit. I'm curious, like, your thoughts on what it means to build an MVP or get to product market fit in this environment. And let's go deep on really like talking about what product builders at the 0 to 1 stage should do in order to increase the probability that they find product market fit.
Yeah, it's fascinating because I'd say 2-3 years ago, like my biggest contrarian, controversial view was that MVPs, this idea of a minimum viable product, is basically dead. And I'd say in the last couple of years, more and more people are coming around to my perspective on MVPs. And so you're starting to see more people talking about this. You remember Patrick Campbell a little while back had written a post being like, this whole lean startup MVP thing just resulted in people like launching shitty software and like wondering why no one was using it, right? And so I think people are coming around to thinking more like I do about this stuff. And I think the most recent take on this comes from Tuomas Artman, who's co-founder at Linear, who wrote this great blog post about this idea. Hey, look, maybe that MVP concept that we all know so well is no longer relevant.
Right.
And I love how he articulates exactly why he thinks it's no longer relevant. And he gets into this idea, hey, look, MVPs are great when you're building in a new market. So when Airbnb was trying to decide, are strangers ever going to sleep on your bed? That's a good thing to test with an MVP because we don't know. It's a brand new behavior. We have no idea whether people would do it. They started with a light MVP at doing this at conferences where people are like sleeping on your couch. And that's a great thing to test when you have no idea what the customer behavior is going to be like. But what Artman points out is, hey, look, most of us are building products in existing markets, right? It turns out you look at Linear, it's a issue tracking app competing with Jira. And because there's an existing market, a highly competitive one with lots of players, there's also a lot of built up expectation in that market about what a product in that market looks like. And so if you go in there and be like, hey, look, here's my shiny little MVP, and you launch it, it's going to fall flat. Have you really learned anything in that case? Maybe simply you had a new novel idea, but wasn't adopted because you didn't have all the other requirements that people expect in an issue tracking software in this day and age, right? And you might have a sort of false negative thinking that your product doesn't work and now you need to pivot, when in fact all you needed to do was fill in the gaps to having a usable product in that market. And so I think this is just one of the challenges you see when people talk about MVPs, is the default way to launch a new product and learn.
Yeah. The one thing he points out in the article that I thought was smart is most people are building in existing markets. And I think even if you're on the edge of a market or you're a new use case for an existing market, the fact is software ate the world, and almost all markets, even if you're doing a new thing that they didn't have before, is touching stuff that they already do with other software. And so it means that there's a switching cost that has developed for most customers over things. And so your differentiator has to be way more differentiated in order for them to go through the pain of it maybe missing other minimum market requirements. But this is like a really hard situation, because if you look at markets broadly, these non-differentiated pieces are massive, right? Massive. They're huge, especially in B2B. Expectations of buyers in terms of legal and procurement and this and this. And I thought what he is interesting is the piece about MVPs that's often missed, because everybody thinks about MVPs as it's a small product, is I think he's still advocating for normal MVP type lean startup stuff on the idea of narrowing your market, right? And I think a big chunk of this article talks about Linear's tactics around narrowing, which I think is interesting because it's like lean startup and MVPs are bad. But this other piece is really important, which is still which is its product market fit. And you can do that by changing the product or changing the market. And I think he still does talk a lot about this. Does that still resonate with you? Do you think market narrowing is still an important piece of the puzzle, or are markets too broad for that now?
I think it totally is spot on in that it's not that you should build this gargantuan product, a fat startup with all the features from day one. You do have to narrow in some way, shape, or form to get this thing out in any reasonable time period. And narrowing the audience is kind of one of the best ways to do this. Now, I have this great story about how I got much more nuanced about MVPs. And it's from actually when I did YC way back in the day. And so
I didn't even know you did YC, by the way. That was new information for me.
Back in 2007. So we were the 4th or 5th batch. It's fascinating how that batch transpired. There was 19 companies in our group. Most of them walked in with an idea and no code into this 3-month batch in Boston, still in Boston at the time.
Oh, you were in the Boston?
Yeah.
In the Boston batch? Okay.
Actually, we were in the last Boston class. There, it just turned out like PG used to love spending his summers in Cambridge. And that's why I was in Boston and we were out in Boston.
Quick aside. I lived in Cambridge around this time. And I lived near the Radcliffe Quad. We had a small 2-bedroom apartment. We were just moving to Boston. Me, my wife, and my then very young daughter. And I used to walk around that neighborhood a lot. And there was this house that had a big Reddit alien in the window. And I'm pretty convinced it was PG and Jessica's house, but I have no verification of that. But I was like, who else in Cambridge has a Reddit alien in the window? It was a very nice house. But then it disappeared. The Reddit alien went away and YC left Boston forever.
But those were the days of YC. Like Paul Graham used to cook us Sloppy Joe sandwiches himself during our weekly dinners. And what was interesting is the whole philosophy was you're in YC, you have 3 months. And we were told you need to build a product in those 3 months, launch it publicly before demo day and try to get some traction going in terms of users so that when you go to demo day, you can be like, here's a product and here's our user growth numbers, right? A really tall order for 3 months. But that was a challenge we all put in front of. And of course, our teams were working 80 to 100 hours to try to make this happen. And so we get close to demo day and nearly all the teams have launched their product. We were building a product called Anywhere.fm. It was this web music player where you can upload your entire music collection online and then play it through an interface that looked like a combination between iTunes and Winamp. We had these like cool visualizers to like visualize like the good old days of Winamp. So we launched this thing. We have thousands of users. We have a nice little week over week graph that we can show on demo day. And most of our other peers had launched as well. Now, there's one startup I remember very specifically didn't launch. They didn't get there. And the founder, we'd all seen his demo. His demo was fantastic. And we're sort of like, I didn't launch. Maybe this guy is like too perfectionist, polishing the thing. So we ended up showing a demo doing demo day, but he had no user numbers to speak of. And honestly, we all felt a little bad for him that like the guy didn't get his product launched. And guess what? Who that was? This was Drew Houston and Dropbox, the one and only company that still exists today that at its height got to decacorn status, right? And it was a really interesting lesson for me because again, I remember at demo day feeling a little bad for Drew and Arash, but in fact, there's insight into the way he thought about it. And the way he thought about it at the time was Dropbox was effectively competing in the cloud storage market.
Right.
There were existing cloud storage tools, but his big differentiator was seamless desktop integration.
It's a folder that syncs.
Exactly.
That's simple.
That's simple. And he really felt it had to be magical. And you had to that first time be like, I don't have to do anything. I have to go to a web interface and log in and drag and drop files to share them. All that goes away. It's just a folder that syncs. And he really felt he had to polish it to get that magical experience so people wouldn't put him in the bucket of any other cloud storage tool, but would instead be like, this is magically different. And that's why he felt like he had a little bit more work to do. And so they did that. And then obviously when they launched, it was magical. It was literally that folder that syncs. And so that's made me far more nuanced now when I think about MVPs and launching. Now, the features were very constrained. Right? It was just the thing that you can share files and back them up in this folder that syncs. But it was narrow, but magical and very well done. And so now when I think about MVPs, I've rarely had a rush to market in the same way of just getting it out there to get feedback. Even though that adds value, this idea that really getting to a minimum delightful product is really important.
There's some good stuff in there, which is there was one thing that mattered, which is it's a folder that syncs. That is very simple. It was probably designed for a more technical end user type. He wasn't trying to build for B2B or things. So that's an interesting narrowing. It's for consumers who have multiple computers. We're reverse engineering. I don't know how much they thought about this then, but I have multiple computers or a folder that multiple people are accessing. I want to make it really simple without them having to log into a file server or anything special like that, drag and drop, etc. What you get is their minimum requirements for this thing that they can't do now are relatively small. But the piece that's important has to just work. It can't work sometimes, right? The other piece of the puzzle here that the Linear article talks about with this is, I don't think he says it explicitly, but that polish is a differentiator. And it's tricky because it's not really a differentiator, it's an expectation, but also that there is a factor of iterating really tightly to make the polish and core experience amazing is impossible to state as a differentiator on an investor slide, but ends up being a thing that makes people ignore a bunch of missing stuff. And that just takes time. The thing that shifted for me is I think you should be embarrassed that it doesn't do certain stuff, but you can't be embarrassed about the surface area of the product you did create. I'm not sure that works anymore.
I totally agree with that. And I think there's this great recent Patrick Collison interview where he was talking about how much they care about kind of beauty and taste and craft. And he was even saying, look, I've never been able to quantify it through an A/B test. Never been able to make that happen.
Impossible.
But I think it's important. And both from I believe in my heart of hearts that it does make a huge difference in terms of the success of your product, even if we can't quantify it, because people just prefer well-built, designed products. And I think Linear is a fantastic example of doing this in kind of a boring category, issue tracking. And so I agree with that if you can narrow the target audience, narrow the scope, but then do that part incredibly well, that looks like a great way to bring something to market in the first place.
Yeah, and I think another thing he doesn't state that I saw as an interesting takeaway is their narrowing was really about developers at small startups, right? Small companies, I think they say. That's explicit. It's pretty narrow, right? But there's another interesting thing here, which is in B2B, I think really an important lesson, which is they hyper narrowed on end user experience, not buyer, decision maker, et cetera type experience. And what that does is it does two things. One, it means that dog fooding and trying things on your own internally, especially if you match your customers, is an awesome way to make it great. Because you're like, I care about these things. They care about these things. I think I'm like that person, et cetera. So I can just build for it. But the second thing is that you take a whole bunch of minimum market requirements off the table. Because in B2B software, most of those things exist below the waterline of the iceberg of what it takes to build a successful software product. It's all behind the scenes. Administration, security, billing, et cetera. All the stuff that's on admin.linear.com or whatever it is, right? And what it does is it creates groundswell in B2B products where now when the boss or the buyer says, we can't use this, it doesn't have X, the end user is like, no way. We're going to keep using it and I don't care. And I'm going to use it on the side. And the reason I say all this is what happened with Slack was that it was really highly polished for interaction type tool. End users loved it. Had a lot of gaps on the administrative enterprise type side, but it ended up you were able to accidentally on some level, maybe through ignorance, maybe through like deliberate action, ignore a lot of things and deal with it as a product market fit expansion problem down the line instead of an initial product market fit problem, which is what would have happened if you tried to build a communication tool for large companies immediately.
Totally. And I think it's like interesting because part of that ability came down to the target audience that each of these tools was going after, right? Like it turns out in developer tools, there's quite a bit of IT empowerment. A developer decides they want to use a new issue tracking thing. They go download it, they use it, and then they get a groundswell of their team using it. And that's okay. That happens. Same with Slack, actually starting with sort of a technical audience. A lot of the Slack teams were these technical audiences, which again, could just download it, start using it. And now would that strategy work for an HR tool like Workday? Probably not, because your average employee is not empowered to go and try out some new HR tool and start using it with their small team. And so part of it, I think, was the smart choosing of the target audience that enabled them to then use a much smaller scope of product and actually successfully get that out of market.
Yep. The other thing I was going to say hate, but I always felt icky about in the original MVP lean startup methodology was it felt, I don't know how to say this kindly, doing whatever your users asked for. Meaning like, it's all about market, find the market and find whatever problem they have. And I feel like every time I've chased this agile/lean startup way of building features, what you end up with is little tools that solve like a pretty narrow problem for a narrow issue that people have. And it lacks like vision, big picture, etc. You end up with edges. And what I loved about the way they described linear, and I want to just read this directly from the blog post because I think it says something, which is we knew we wanted our product to demonstrate 3 values. It should be as fast as possible, with a couple of details about that, including offline access. It should be modern, keyboard shortcuts, command menu, context menus. And it should be multiplayer with real-time sync and teammate presence. That's a really strong opinion about what an issue tracker should be. And it tells you where you need to spend your time and energy on the polish and details, which I think if you're going to go this route, I think it's important to have like strict, hard product values that are differentiated. All 3 of these turn out not to be true for the most common issue tracking platforms, Bookzilla, Jira, whatever. And I thought that was interesting as they're saying, we didn't do MVP, blah, blah, blah. We narrowed, but it's also like really strong conviction around like a weird set of stuff.
Yeah. And this is the real interesting nuance of this stuff, right? So if you have a team that doesn't have much conviction, doesn't have much opinions on what's really going to work in the market, and you don't have strong judgment, Yeah, launch an MVP, get it out to the market and see how the market reacts, because that's going to build that intuition and get that feedback for you. Now, in this new class of seasoned entrepreneurs that are often launching products, what they're starting with is usually a domain they're very familiar with. Yep. They're starting with experience, which has built their taste, built their judgment, and now they can actually attack a market with an opinionated view, just like Linear has, right? They're like, we think issue tracking could be better because of these 3 pillars, these very specific pillars. And they have that conviction and they have that judgment. And now they are best served by building a product that demonstrates those pillars. They talk about being in closed beta for over a year till they got that right, and then ultimately launching well after that. And so I think this is the thing where you're seeing it when you can have this strong judgment about what you think the market needs. You can then go off and build that thing, especially when you're your own customer, like you see in this category.
Yeah.
And that actually works way better than launching, getting some feedback, pivoting based on what you're hearing on the feedback. And I think this judgment and craft and taste is like hard to teach. And in fact, usually requires a lot of experience, but ultimately leads to better outcomes.
Yeah, he even gives an anecdote. He showed it to a friend and they were like, yeah, it's fast enough. I don't need real-time sync. I don't like keyboard shortcuts. The thing is that I don't think if you asked someone, if you got out of the building in the classic lean startup sense and said, would you switch your issue tracker if it was fast, modern, and had real-time sync? You'd be like, probably not, right? Probably not. You're entrenched. You feel like the thing, it's a water heater problem, as we call it. You only complain if it's broken. It works fine, no problem. But there is this underswell of the engineers don't love it, but they can't tell you why. You have to show your work, if that makes sense. And it has to not just talk about demonstrating those values. And so, again, this is existing market with a sophisticated set of end users who already are bought into an existing product. Then this kind of stuff makes a ton of sense. I will say they did do the thing you just talked about, which is iterate with users. It's just that there was more there. They were super narrow. And I love the way they described. A lot of people use a waitlist as a way to like generate hype. And then they send an email to the full waitlist. And they're like, how come nobody uses our product? I think the real gold in this article is the last bit about how they use the waitlist. Like they narrowed on product and audience. And then they explicitly use the waitlist as a way to pre-qualify and only add customers for whom they knew it would be a good fit, which I think is like just brilliant in terms of like how to use hype, to segue from our last conversation, to build, not just market a product.
Totally. And I think this is actually the nuance here. The best practice is, in fact, to build some form of product, an MVP, do a closed beta, bring in waves of users, and in fact, get them to test and iterate with the product. And I think this is important because that technique is, in fact, better than doing simply launching your MVP and seeing who you get. Right. Yeah. And I think it's important to understand that because I've done both and realized that, oh man, as soon as you publicly launch, you have such high volume. It turns out a lot of your learning is through shallow means, through metrics, through quick conversations or support requests you're getting. Versus in a closed beta, when you're meeting with a team that you've pre-qualified that has more willingness to engage with you, you're talking to them regularly. You're figuring out what's working, what's not working. And that enables you to be far more iterative in improving the product in a deeper way than once you launch and get to that point where it's just way harder to actually iterate and learn from the customer. And so that's where that closed beta is definitely a best practice, and waitlists contribute to that.
And it's not just that the fidelity of knowledge goes down because you're going from conversations down to metrics. When you're public, you have no control over who's signing up. I think you said this, but it's just worth making explicit. You have no control over whether your acquisition matches your target ICPs and market. None. With a waitlist, you have perfect control. Perfect control. One, it's very hard to build a good wait list. They basically say we use our social following. Good luck if you're not already like a person with a broad following. But they are able to say, if we have 1,000 signups and only 3 fit our target market, we're only going to add 3. And I think that's just like the like really gold message in this is like, the problems people run into building new products is taking the feedback of people you aren't ready to take the feedback for. It's not that they're not a fit, they're not a fit now. And the danger you run into as you go wide like this is you start to lose your strategy. I was just working with a company on this and we really mapped out their segments and we really, who are we willing to serve, but not going to focus on? Who are we focused on? Who are we selling up market to? And by just putting some boxes around it, it made us realize that it's not that none of this feedback matters, but none of it matters now. And sometimes I think the waitlist is an awesome way to manufacture that, right?
I think that's exactly right. And I think this is where I think too often people have this view that more is better, more users is better. Hey, even if they're not in our target, like they're trying it out, maybe they know someone that's gonna bring them in.
We'll get some virality. There will be network effects. Yeah,
exactly. But this is the exact challenge because then when you start getting feedback, it's all noise. You have terrible retention. Is that purely because they're not in your target segment? And some people have some aspirations that they're going to clean up the data and look at their target segment. It's so hard to do when you publicly launch.
Yeah.
Then you're getting all this feedback and you're trying to decide which feedback do you listen to, which one is coming from your target audience versus not. And so that's where the closed beta ends up being, even though you're talking way smaller volume in terms of users, way more targeted in terms of who you're getting feedback from in order to iterate and improve the product.
The hard part here is there's a lot of pressure still on startups to launch. Or let's ignore startups for a second. For new products to launch at existing companies, for features to get launched, to be public. And it feels like it takes a lot of leadership and conviction to hold this process, which is why I think so few people do it and why it's so hard. It's not just the conventional wisdom is you're hiding from the market, you're taking too long, you're polishing a turd or whatever. It's that growth is the oxygen for products. And this is not just about startups. This is true for every product. And so like, how do you suggest, I don't know, as someone who's built products 0 to 1 inside a company is how do you help the organization be comfortable with slow growth, which is a deliberate part of this strategy is slow growth. It's not no growth, but it's very slow, deliberate growth.
It's a great question. I think sharing my own story with LinkedIn Sales Navigator, I think would be helpful to describe how I actually dealt with this and how I solved for it. When I was at LinkedIn, I got the opportunity to incubate a brand new product called LinkedIn Sales Navigator. And the idea was, hey, look, LinkedIn makes a lot of money off recruiters. We also have a lot of salespeople on LinkedIn. We should probably be able to build a meaningful product for salespeople. And Sachin, why don't you go figure that out? So that's the mandate, which is build a product for salespeople. And what I built was entirely up to my team. So real 0 to 1 idea generation, which was super awesome. Now, the first thing we did is talk to tons of customers. And I think this is the obvious thing, but I think even the talking to customers, people often don't do well. And so we did waves of customer interviews where we talked to them. And when we started incredibly high level, right? And this is important. You want to change the fidelity of your customer conversation based on what you're trying to learn. At first, we're trying to figure out what problems they had. I've seen people when they first have customer conversation go in with a mock-up. Now, when you go in with a mock-up, you're going to get feedback on how to improve the mock-up, not whether the mock-up matters, right? And what we really want feedback on is, do you care about this problem?
Right.
Is this even important to you? And when you're going in with something a higher fidelity, you lose sight of that. And so that's where we spent just time trying to understand what are the problems that people are having in the sales process and the sales funnel, where we thought LinkedIn could add some value, given the fact that we had millions of members that we could use to help you prospect and whatnot. And so we kept increasing the fidelity of our conversations as we narrowed in on value proposition. So we would have hundreds of conversations. Now, part of it is I think people stop in often at tens of conversations because it's so much work to recruit potential customers. Obviously, at LinkedIn, we were lucky we had the salespeople on the platform, so it was easy to recruit them. But still, you want to go have lots and lots of conversations. And so I think that's the first step. And now what was interesting from that, we started to formulate what we thought was a compelling strategy that we took back to our leadership team. And we're like, hey, look, here's where our customers are saying their biggest problems are. Here's how we think we can solve it. Here's how we're different than all the other tools that exist in the marketplace. Of course, being LinkedIn, we were always being sized up against Salesforce, the number one sales tool in the world. And so we're like, how do we create unique value there? And now that we started to have a strategy in place, what we did was start to ask ourselves, what is the biggest risk here? Why would this not work? And being honest with what is the assumption here that was the riskiest. Now, a really interesting one for us at Sales Navigator was we wanted to sell this in a B2B context. And what we saw in the sales tools marketplace, there was Salesforce, which was the big behemoth. And then there was data providers. So you buy some sales prospecting data. And then everything else, anything that looked like what we were thinking of building, a sales intelligence tool, a sales acceleration tool, sales productivity tool, they're all selling at like $10 a user per month. There's no way you can field a sales team at that price point. And so we had to build something that was like more expensive, but we didn't know whether the market would bear it, whether the market would even be willing to pay more money than what these existing tools that existed. So that was our biggest risk. Would people even be willing to pay what we wanted to sell the thing for, like $80 a user per month? And so given that, we picked our validation technique to solve for that. And so we did pre-sales. And so what it was, we put together a fake pitch deck, which had our value props, our messaging, our positioning. It had a click-through mock-ups of what the product would look like in terms of actual features. And we then put a salesperson in front of a bunch of prospective customers. And we said, hey, look, here's what we're planning on building. Here's exactly what it'll do. Will you sign up for our paid pilot? And initially we did unpaid pilots, but had like real commitment. You have to have at least 15 reps join, and they have to commit to like sessions in terms of feedback. So real commitment. And we got a lot of no's. Seems like your price is high. I don't know if this is really valuable. So we kept iterating on the deck, on the features that we were showcasing in the deck. And our goal was to get to a 40% conversion rate. 40% of people we pitched said yes to joining our either free or paid pilot, depending on how far we were. And once we got there, we're like, okay, with that kind of conversion rate, we can field a sales team. We can actually go build a real business around this.
Right.
Now, of course, the team is building the product along the way, but we're doing this pre-sales effort to validate the thing that was our risky assumption. And that's where I think is really the learning here.
Not to push back on the lean startup-y, but that feels pretty lean startup-y, right? To be like, oh, we're iterating on a deck version and we're focused on the sales process. Do you think in this market, like at this time, you would have to change how you built that? Do you think a deck would be enough? If I were trying to build a better LinkedIn Sales Navigator, for instance, would the deck be enough? Or would I probably, I mean, there are tools in the space. I don't know exactly what all of them are. One that stands out is Apollo and some of the other automation stuff. Let's say you were like building an AI Sales Navigator. Do you think it's enough to do the deck? Or do you think you'd have to build a product? Would you do it differently now?
Yeah, so I think the deck helps inform what you're building in that initial closed beta that you're going to launch to a set of customers that you're going to work closely with.
Got it.
And so it's really about staging these efforts, right? But you can do a lot of validation at the deck level to inform what people are willing to pay for. And what I like about it is because you're asking for a commitment, you're getting a real yay or nay. Yeah. It's better than just, hey, here's a bunch of features. Which ones do you like? Which ones do you not like? To figure out what's worth building. Now, I think you're right in that, especially outside of the context of a large company like LinkedIn, where you have a bunch of brands that are willing to bet on LinkedIn because we were who we are. You're a startup, you don't have that. And so you have to ultimately get them further along to get them a full commitment, right? Yeah. And so then building that closed beta with those customers and then iterating is a great way to go. The point being that there's way more validation you can do well before building, because it's more expensive. If we were just building lots of features, it would have been way more expensive to iterate with those customers.
Yeah, it's interesting because there's different validation paths for different things. I think as a startup, chances of you getting a 40% close on a deck nowadays, Again, because of the dopamine culture changes that we've talked about, because of the changes we talked about in terms of software eating the world and everything has an existing product in them, et cetera. I think in this world, they'll be like, I'll try it, but you got to show it to me. If I said, hey, it's LinkedIn Sales Navigator, but it's fast, it's better network, I don't know, whatever the three values are for that, AI driven, et cetera, the first question people are going to ask is, sounds great, but does it work? And is it enough better than the existing product? And so I think, that's just my thought is that, like even with this is, okay, we're doing validating and building, but maybe the right way, the only way to do that today would be, it's not just salespeople. It's salespeople at startups selling new products into existing who are founder or early first salespeople at their company, don't have a big tool suite, are not using Salesforce yet, like Narrow, and then let's pilot with them and build the perfect product. And actually, we're going to sell ourselves with it, right? And dog food as step one. And then only then be like, how much would you pay for this? And I'd be like, $10,000 a month. And you're like, great, let's move on. It's interesting how it's just like a reversal. I think this is a great example because it shows like, I'm not sure that process would work as well in this modern era if you were selling into an existing market.
Yeah, and I think the fascinating point you're bringing up here, which is the counterintuitive challenge of building these things inside of large companies, where of course we're like trying to go after big market opportunities, but we spent a lot of time initially narrowing our target audience that our V1 product would sell to for Sales Navigator, right? So
it's not just all salespeople. So
right.
What were some of those narrowings? I think that's always interesting to hear from.
Yeah, and so it's important to realize that now Sales Navigator is at scale. It's doing about $1 billion in annual sales, right? Especially post Microsoft acquisition, they're selling to everyone. Now, where did we start? Complete polar opposite, very, very narrow. So first, we looked at either consumer sales or B2B sales. We said only B2B. So if you're selling this to consumers, nowadays we do have private wealth managers using it as like a high-end sales tool, but we're like, all we care about is B2B. Then what we said is, let's focus the industry. And it turned out people use Sales Navigator as a prospecting tool to find potential buyers to sell into. What that means is LinkedIn has to have strong density of those buyers on the platform. And so we realized tech and finance were the two verticals where we had incredible amount of density. And so we said, okay, we're going after B2B and we're going after tech and finance verticals.
So people who sell to tech and finance, basically.
People who sell to tech and finance. That's right. Now, another thing was, it turns out when you actually look at sales teams, there's effectively two kinds of salespeople. We colloquially call them hunters and farmers, right? Hunters are people who are acquiring new business, convincing you to buy the product for the first time. Those are the hunters. They're hunting new business. Now, farmers are people that your company is already using the product. These farmers will help grow that account, increase your spend within that company. And what we noticed was when we looked at all salespeople, about 50% at scale are hunters and 50% are farmers. But we realized we were going to be really good for the hunters when you're trying to close that business the first time, not when you're growing. And so we decided that was going to be our target audience. And then we also realized this only works for like relationship sales. If you're doing coin-op transactional sales, you don't care about prospecting and warm introductions and all that stuff. And so we said the product you're selling has to be at least 100K ACV. And so we got pretty specific here, right? So we're talking about B2B sales reps, fintech and technology and fintech, hunters, not farmers, plus 100K ACV. Very, very narrow audience. And, I got some pushback at LinkedIn. I'm like, hey, that seems like a small TAM. But the point was, this isn't who we were going to go after eventually, but it's who we're going to start with.
Right.
And that narrowing, I think, is often uncomfortable for startups who, again, you're pitching your VC on the big market opportunity, but that's not who you should be executing on a daily basis to sell to.
Right. No, I think that's great advice. So takeaways here, I think one is building 0 to 1 products in brand new markets and new product categories is dramatically different than those that are even adjacent or touching existing product categories. And I think it's important that people understand those differences. And that's where honestly, a lot of the arguments about lean startup are really a category problem, not a process problem. It's the right process for the right thing. I think the second takeaway that I got out of this conversation is the piece about narrowing that we just ended on. That product market fit is about products, but it's also about markets. And the best way to build something small, but that is still high quality, is by narrowing till you find a common set of customers with very currently unmet needs, maybe, or whose product values, which I'll talk about next, align with yours in terms of what they want and what you're delivering. I thought that was an interesting one. The next is, have conviction. That one's pretty straightforward. Not a lot to say about that. Anything else that stood out? Like, I feel like I always like to summarize our conversations here as a way to make sure we're giving good lessons.
Yeah, and I think that's right. Now, I think the one caveat I like to point out on this thing is the one area where I think MVPs is still the best way to go is consumer social. And it's basically this category where it is very difficult to anticipate how someone is going to react to a new consumer social experience. Take a recent example, AirChat. I think it was great how they got it out, used a closed beta, and increased the audience. And that's the only way you iterate on this category. Now, it doesn't apply to consumer overall. Let's say you're doing consumer fintech or consumer real estate. That stuff, I think a lot of the other validation techniques are appropriate and still work. But that's the one category where I think I'd rush people to get an MVP out.
But that leads me to the last one, which is the waitlist is not just a hype building tool. It is a product market fit discovery tool. That's, I think, the key one is that, like, you need to be using your waitlist strategically to align the product and market with each other and make sure you're only inviting people who are actually your target audience. I think that's like key. And I think AirChat did that really well early, honestly, eventually opening it up to grow to a lot of other people. And maybe it'll help them, maybe it won't, who knows? But I think that's absolutely right. Sachin, a pleasure as always to have you on the show.
Yeah.
Or just to hang out, honestly. I feel like I always learn a ton.
Yeah, this was super fun. Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Thanks for joining us for both parts of our conversation with Sachin Rekhi. We went from dopamine culture to MVPs. It was a wide-ranging set of conversations, but I enjoyed it a lot, and I hope you got a lot out of it as well. We'll see you next week for our next episode. Thanks again.